Welcome to the Hidden Orchard podcast, a radical exploration of spirituality, science, and the Bible from a Jewish perspective. Each week we'll look at a new topic and dive deep into the texts that inspire and enrich our lives. So whether you're a seasoned expert or just curious about a topic, there's something for everyone. So sit back, relax, and we'll get to today's episode in a bit. But first, if you haven't done so, visit thehiddenorchard.com and subscribe. It's free, and you'll receive access to content and weekly emails. There you can also subscribe for a paid membership and get access to everything on the site and be the first to hear about online study opportunities where you can meet and interact with other people on the journey. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you have an idea for a topic, reach out to me at thehiddenorchard.com. Now, let's get to today's episode. Often in this space of interfaith discussion, there are a few common objections that come up when Jewish tradition or extra-biblical content is brought into New Testament discussions. Where is that in the Bible? Or, if it's not in the Bible, then it's not authoritative. Another one, the rabbis rejected Jesus. Why should we listen to them? These objections might be related, actually grouped under the concept of what it means for a writing to be inspired or God-breathed. According to GotQuestions.org, the idea of inspired is defined as follows. Here we see the truths of Scripture described as coming directly from God, not from the will of the writers He used to record them. Now, beginning my foray into understanding the Bible through its native Jewish context, I was frequently warned that the rabbinic writings are not inspired or not living. Though opinions vary on what inspired seems to mean, the underlying assumptions that the Jewish tradition is man-made, unreliable, and maybe even dangerous. Practically, this means that anything outside the Bible, the canon, is off limits and not a source of reliable knowledge for truth or spiritual development. It seems to me that this idea is more prevalent in Protestant denominations, which is enforced through sola scriptura, an idea we've covered before, in which it's inferred that the biblical interpretation is only reliable from within the Bible itself. In other words, the Bible can explain itself, and you don't need anything else outside of that. But what happens when the rabbinic material supports and aligns with the teachings in the New Testament? What do we do with the apostolic quotations of extra-biblical material? Or when rabbinic metaphors and midrash and maxims form the basis of New Testament writings? Does this mean that these teachings are also inspired? Or do we chalk these up to dumb luck on the part of the rabbis? Okay, so let's first describe what God-breathed or inspired means. When asked where the idea of inspired originates, many will point to the words of Paul in 2 Timothy 3:16, where Paul says, "All Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness." Paul teaches that all Scripture is useful for teaching and developing righteousness. But between the lines of Paul's statement are unexplored assumptions, many of which emerged long after the apostolic era. And while his words do not overtly preclude tradition, but simply rank Scripture at the top, some read this idea as a biblical launchpad to abandon tradition altogether. So let's solve a number of problems here and kind of revisit these assumptions. Number one is the idea of Scripture versus tradition. The first problem or irony that we're confronted with is that this assumption is itself a tradition, and it's not a Jewish one. See, the Jewish people have preserved and honored the Torah above all else, but this did not and still does not prevent the study of the growing body of resources that aid in the understanding of Torah. In our time, even so-called secular science, often viewed as antithetical to faith, has deep insights to offer into the ways of God, into the nature of creation. Thus, a vast and ever-expanding library has grown over time. Volumes and volumes of midrash and Talmudic statements and commentaries, sermons, teachings, and even stories passed down from generation to generation. It's been my position that cutting off access to this body of tradition has done damage to the New Testament, removing it from its native context, exposing significant knowledge gaps. And of course, over time, these gaps are filled with new traditions. The second assumption we'll want to acknowledge is the definition of what we call Scripture. The truth is, the list of books collectively called the Bible has never found unanimity, and this varies by tradition. In Christianity alone, the Bible looks different, whether you are Catholic, Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Coptic, Protestant, or other group. Accordingly, the apocryphal books like Wisdom, Sirach, and Maccabees are still part of the canon in Orthodox and Catholic Bibles, but are virtually unheard of in Protestant circles. In the case of the Protestant canon, the list of books has been reduced over time, even removing the deuterocanonical writings as late as the 1700s. So what's considered God-breathed or inspired for one denomination may no longer be for another. Third is Paul's idea of the word Scripture. This is a big problem. Some may be surprised to know that the Scripture Paul spoke about was essentially the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, also known as the Old Testament. The word for Scriptures used in 2 Timothy 3:16 is a word that's used throughout the New Testament to speak of the Hebrew Bible. For example, we see the same nuance in Luke 24:27, where it says, "And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the Scriptures, the things concerning himself." But there's an issue with this. It's likely the collection that we call the Hebrew Bible wasn't fully settled in Paul's time either. Indeed, the Torah was established and the prophets, but it seems some of the wisdom literature may have been under discussion along with other popular writings. Even the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was itself a result of a multi-century process. So in short, what Paul called Scripture was a much smaller volume than we assume today. And this brings us to the fourth problem we need to resolve. Here is the big point to understand. The New Testament, as we know it today, simply did not exist in the first century. Though many of the writings existed in some form, their compilations would not occur until nearly 300 years after Paul's letter to Timothy. It seems the first attempts to create a sort of canon may have been by Marcion around 140 CE. And though Marcion was eventually deemed a heretic, his radical editing process sought to separate the Hebrew scriptures from the apostolic writings. Of course, this distinction has persisted well into modern times. And again, ironically, this move towards canonization began in response to controversy, not a divine mandate. Very much a man-made tradition. I believe Marcion's motivation, in part, may have been his desire to cut off Jewish influence in the wake of the the Bar Kokhba Wars. Even as late as the mid-300s, early church figures like Eusebius wrote that some books were still under dispute. And it was around 367 CE that the full 27 books of the modern New Testament were listed together in the form we now recognize. And it even seems that what they considered to be inspired changed over time. So in Paul's time, he likely would not have considered his own letters, or even the apostolic works, inspired, not on the same level as Torah. As Bible scholar Bruce Metzger summarizes, neither Jesus nor his apostles left us a defined list of inspired books. The canon emerged slowly through a complex process of usage, debate, and consensus. So that brings us back to the question, what does it mean when we say inspired? So the Greek used in 2 Timothy literally means breathed by God. It appears nowhere else in the New Testament. And I don't personally think Paul was drawing new boundary lines or an approved book list for his audience. He was affirming the holiness and the usefulness of the Torah and the prophets, which were already known to his communities. And this is why we often see the reference in the Gospels to Moses and the prophets, to the Torah and the prophets. Further, I view Paul's words as poetic, possibly alluding to the Midrash about the breath of God from which all of creation was brought into existence. So the final thought, the Torah is indeed the eternal word of the Creator. It's infinitely deep and far beyond what any one person could ever fully comprehend. Multiple lifetimes wouldn't be nearly enough to uncover its wisdom, which is why Jewish thought has preserved an accumulated well of insight that spans generations. The worldview of the Torah encourages participation, deep questions, wrestling, and the passing on of all that we learn in our time. If we're truly committed to understanding what Jesus and the apostles wrote, not just the words they said, but the meanings behind them, we simply can't ignore the world they were immersed in. Their world and the assumptions were shaped by Scripture, that's true, but also by centuries of oral teachings that sought to shine its light into every aspect of daily life. These traditions may not have been directly written down in the Bible, yet they inform and illuminate every sentence of it. That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this topic. Remember, you can find more information at thehiddenorchard.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and share this podcast with your friends. We don't really engage in marketing, so it's word of mouth and references like that really help spread the word. Also, I want to say thank you to those who subscribe to the site and those who support the Hidden Orchard Project financially. Without you, it wouldn't be possible, so thank you. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.